Well, thanks very much, Shirley, and thank you all for coming this evening. I want to focus in the 8 minutes I've been allocated on the big deceit that we're up against in British politics. First, that the entire global financial crisis was caused by Labour recruiting too many police officers, nurses, teachers and social workers. That the subprime mortgage defaults were all the responsibility of Labour. The first big deceit. The second is the claim that our public sector deficit, that the Tory Lib Dems continuously talk about, and that we left in 2010, was caused by high Labour spending. They never admit to the truth, which is if Labour spending was too high, if it was out of control, as they say it was, why did George Osborne and Cameron sign up to it in the autumn of 2007 when they committed themselves to Labour's spending plans through the 2010 election? So always remind people about that. If it was unaffordable, if it was out of control, they never would have committed to Labour spending. They never admit either that before the global banking crisis, British government debt under Labour was low, below that of France, Germany, the USA, Japan, lower, significantly lower than when we took over from the Tories in 1997, and 10 years of steady economic growth allowed us to pay down the national debt by the equivalent of £90 billion today, saving taxpayers £3 billion a year in interest payments. We did fix the roof while the sun was shining, as the Tories always tried to deny. And between 1997 and 2007, just before the banking crisis, Labour borrowing averaged one-third of average annual Tory borrowing under Thatcher and Major. Where we went wrong is not in spending or borrowing too much. With every other government in the world, we didn't regulate the banks properly. That was the cause of what has been the most catastrophic global depression since the 1930s. Another Tory deceit, which is current, that the recession that they are now presiding over was made in Europe. It was actually made in Britain, in Downing Street. IMF figures confirm that the UK budget squeeze since 2009 has been twice as tight as that in the Eurozone. It's not actually the Eurozone that's holding Britain back, it's our own policies that are holding Britain back, together with the same austerity that is being followed right across the European Union. That's what's actually we're dragging each other down. And what they'd say nothing about is the fact that whereas Europe contributes 50% of our trade, the US contributes 20% of our trade. And the US economy, which as I say contributes a fifth of our trade, is currently growing 4 times faster than the Eurozone is slowing. So American growth and its impact on Britain has offset Eurozone sloth. The US took the route of economic stimulus and stuck to it. They're now reaping the reward and growing again, where we're stagnant. Britain set out on the same course under Labour, under your last Labour government, after the banking crisis, and you started to see the economy pick up. Unemployment falling, growth hesitantly rising, inflation staying low, long-term bond yields staying low as well. So we were able to maintain international market confidence. But then when this current government took over, they immediately reversed that growth stimulus into a cut stimulus, and we saw what was happening. We're now living through the longest lasting economic slump since the 19th century. And we warned at the time that cutting too far and too fast would choke off recovery and make achievement of these borrowing, debt and deficit targets impossible. That's exactly what's happened. So the deficit is now 78 billion higher than the coalition government forecast in 2010. 78 billion higher deficit. Borrowing is 245 billion higher than they forecast. Debt is 309 billion higher than they forecast. So their own strategy, which is focused entirely on cuts, and more austerity to get these 3 key targets down, has actually failed as well. And when we look at the solutions to that, there's masses of spare capacity in the British economy to take up the slack. The economy could grow quite easily and quickly for a few years because of this slack. Jonathan Porter is the chief economist of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and actually a former government chief economist at the Cabinet Office, said a few years of 3% growth, and given the amount of spare capacity in the UK economy, there's no reason why that should be unfeasible. Much of the problem of deficits, borrowing and debt would simply disappear. So the scope for growth is much, much higher than the government is saying. That's what the IMF says, it's what the Institute for Fiscal Studies says, it's what economists like Bob Rowthorne and Bill Martin say, it's what a number of other institutes say. So if that growth strategy was adopted, then the fiscal squeeze needed to deal with the historic problems of borrowing and the deficit and debt would actually require, would be far less serious than the Tories or Lib Dems are embarking on, far less serious, and even more less serious than seems to be the current thinking on the Labour front bench. So the name of the game is growth. Once you get growth, borrowing comes down, deficit down, and the debt comes down again. Now, the Tory charge at the moment, and they make it repeatedly, is borrowing is higher, so Labour would borrow even more. And there's a kind of common sense, it strikes a chord with the electorate. We've got to be very confident about this. We've got to be on the front foot, far more than we are. Yes, we would borrow more in the short term, in order to bring borrowing down in the medium to longer term. And that's exactly what happened under President Obama. His 2009 stimulus package added to the US federal deficit in the short term, but then when interest rates fell, spending and output rose, dull queues shortened. As a proportion of America's expanding GDP, the overall deficit has shrunk every year since then. So that's a strategy that works. We cut our deficit by a third and brought the economy to a stop. Obama also cut the US deficit by a third, but last year the economy grew 10 times faster than ours did. So, what have we got to do? We could take the CBI's call for 10 billion extra infrastructure investment. We could begin with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, a growth objective of 20 billion public investment stimulus. Or we could go with Jonathan Porter's own 30 billion programme of infrastructure investment, which I must say attracts me. More cuts and austerity will continue Britain's economic inertia, destroying our claims to offer a serious alternative to what I call the scorched earth economics being pursued across Britain and across Europe. And I want to make the comparison before I close with 1997. Before 1997, Labour signed up to Tory spending plans for the next 2 years. But that was in the context of a growing economy. We were trying to show, after 18 years out of government, that we could be fiscally responsible with the fruits of that growth. We don't have a growing economy. We're not going to have a growing economy. We've got a slowing economy. And I think that it would be disastrous to re-pledge that, make that kind of pledge again. So the way to cut borrowing and bring down Britain's debt burden is to get the economy growing again. Most of the budget deficit will disappear once the economy returns to full capacity working, and any shortfall can be tackled over the next Parliament on the basis of a successful economic record. And unless, and I conclude on this, unless we offer a clear alternative at the next election, one that is fiscally prudent and is seen to be responsible and has all the answers to debt and borrowing and the deficit that the right-wing media and the Tories charge us with all the time. Unless we have that clear alternative, which is absolutely not an austerity alternative, but is also fiscally responsible, then I don't see why the average voter won't choose what they've got already than a clear Labour alternative. And I hope that next generation Labour will pursue that course in the future. Thanks very much.